Excited for this next talk. A lot of companies that we work with are always interested in how they get adoption within larger corporations. And whenever you're talking as a vendor trying to sell into a customer, the question always becomes, okay, are we gonna, if we're the big customer, are we gonna roll our own product? Are we gonna buy from a vendor, or is there some other solution, like an open source solution that we could evaluate, roll it our own, and then implement it in the company? So we have a great cross section here of folks from the early stage community as well as the corporate community to help us out with this topic. So without further ado, Randy from Cooley will be hosting this conversation. Thanks, Randy, for being here.
No problem. Morning, everyone. As Court said, this is a panel that is a cross-section. We've got some interesting things to talk about. We did our prep call on Friday, and I told the folks, I don't like just sitting here and reading off questions, so I'm going to encourage them to jump in and interrupt each other and challenge things, but I want you to do the same. We can have questions during the session. Would much prefer an interactive session as opposed to me asking a bunch of questions. So as Court mentioned, my name is Randy Sabet. I'm the vice chair of the privacy and data protection practice at Cooley. I'm a lawyer there, but in a previous life, I was a crypto engineer at the NSA. So as I told the folks on Friday, my elevator joke is that I went from one dark side working at the NSA to a darker side, became an attorney years later. If anybody's interested in a second or maybe a third career, highly encourage you to think about the law. The law, as you are probably well aware, is there are far too few people with your kind of skills in the legal profession, and we're getting some really bad stuff as a result of it. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off of that for now. What we'll do is we'll go down the panel, allow the panelists to sort of do a short introduction, maybe say a few words, and then I've got some questions here, but again, I encourage you to jump in with your own. So without further ado, Jason. Thank you.
So I'm Jason Craig. I work at Dropbox. I lead our detection and response team. We don't have a SOC. We don't have analysts. We have a bunch of engineers who build stuff and then use it. I encourage you all to do the same if you can. I've worked for a few other organizations you probably have heard of, but it's not relevant.
So my name's Craig Chamberlain. I'm security lead at a startup here in Boston called Cogito. It's an early stage startup that came out of MIT. My background is I've been doing security since I was a kid, more or less, and during that time I've been at 4 startups, 2 exits. In between startups, I've done some special projects in the defense sector and the financial services world. I've been a security lead at one of the largest AWS environments. I've done a lot of fun things, and here to participate.
Okay, my name is Brian Riley. I've never worked at a startup before. I've always been on the industry side. I'm currently senior architect in global information security at Liberty Mutual Insurance. I've been at Liberty for 11 years after spending 10 years on Wall Street. My main focus right now is on cloud security architecture and trying to understand how we can leverage cloud technologies to improve our overall security.
Cool. And I'm Christopher Ahlberg. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Recorded Future, local cyber company that a few might have heard of. We do threat intelligence and sort of collect from open sources and closed, hard to get to sources, as well as a lot of technical sourcing, and pull that together in good ways. We're a big consumer of open source software, just both for our own collection and analysis, but also when you sort of get too deep into all that stuff, you also have to start defending yourself. So, on that side as well. So hopefully some interesting perspectives to this.
All right, great. So there's the panel. As you may have seen in the literature, the title of the panel is Too Many Products, Too Little Time, How Are Companies Evaluating New Solutions? Quite a mouthful. I would rather name it or title it, What Do I Do to Get the Next Blinky Box? Okay, and then what do I do with it once I get it? We were calling it the build versus buy panel, and I think that's really where the discussion is going to center on, is how do you get the next product in, and then what do you do with it? So with that as the lead-in, what are your priorities over the next, say, 12 to 18 months for your organization in terms of security? Just jump in.
Automation. Automation first and foremost. So we're at a point in our maturity where we're pretty close to the top of the pyramid. We have a ridiculous amount of data. We have a very low risk tolerance, which means we chase down all the weird stuff we see, which means that we have a lot of work. because we have a lot of engineers who get to do whatever they want, and we do not want to change that culture, which puts the onus on our team to proactively hunt things very quickly and to quickly get to ground truth as to whether they're bad, whether they're odd, whether they're good, and to whitelist them and move on with our day. So we try to automate as much of that as possible. That's the thing we're still struggling with, but it's a thing that we need to do a lot more of. And I would say automation applies across the board for lots of different things. So like saying, hey, have we ever seen someone typing this command on a terminal on a Mac before? To tying that to a session, maybe someone SSHing into production who's authorized to do so and their behavior there. Making a statement around, is their box in a state that we want it to be in before they get into production, things like that. So automation first and foremost.
Okay, Brian, you were nodding. Agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. So automation, especially in some cloud environments, is going to be a fundamental way that you understand what's going on in your environment and can automate the reactions to it. So that is a big part of my focus. Just to sort of answer the more general question, though, from Liberty Mutual's perspective, over the next 18 months, what are we looking for? I'll give 2 security priorities and then 2 broader enterprise priorities. So visibility, let's just make sure that we understand what's going on in our network, very much as Liam was saying in the keynote. And then number 2, modernizing our identity platform. So like every large organization, we have a massive identity and access management infrastructure. Let's try to bring that into the 21st century. And then more at the broader enterprise goals objectives. We're looking at transforming our delivery of IT services from the waterfall classical models and really embracing agility and empowering our developers to get new products into our customers' hands a lot faster than they've been able to do before. And the final point, which is where I spend my daily life now, which is figuring out how to adopt and manage and consume cloud services securely.
Yeah, so on our side, we sort of have one aspect of this, which is, we have T-shirts in the company that basically says "need to get all the data," means scale of his prior employer of collection, and that means you need to be able to deal with a lot of data, and that's an interesting challenge in itself. Then on the other side, there is automation, kind of exactly what we heard here. So our customers wants to consume this data, and sometimes into open source environments, sometimes into sort of very low cost tools, I don't know, Maltego, whatever it now may be, or into commercial tools. So figuring out the APIs that needs to make that happen. I'll throw in one piece, which I think is pretty interesting, though. We're finding now that we're collecting data closer and closer to the guys, call them bad guys, whatever, where you get more nervous about collection, where you actually have to be very careful. So figuring out how you can collect close to where the adversary, you actually have an adversary. And so figuring out how you can do that without tripping yourself up. And it's probably as far as I'll get into that here, but that adds some pretty interesting challenges.
So I will agree on, I'll give a +1 kind of to automation. So as the problem of talent inflation and talent scarcity continues to worsen in the technology markets, automation is becoming more and more key. There was a quote, and I can't tell you who this attributes to, but there used to be a semi-famous quote where somebody used to say that IT has done a great job at automating everything except itself across the business. And this is one of the areas where I think we can do better. For me, I think the overarching priority is to make sure that we make very thoughtful and good design decisions so that as we scale and as we grow, we have good and efficient results. Which is one of the nice things about being in a relative greenfield. You have the opportunity to do that.
Okay, great. Questions at this point from the audience? Sir.
It sounds like you're automating log analysis and stuff. Are you automating anything in software development, like source code scanning, web application vulnerability scanning, any of that stuff?
Everybody hear the question? Okay.
Yes, I would say we'd be negligent if we weren't doing that. So the stuff that I'm describing, I lead our detection and response team. So we have another group that focuses on product security. And product security definitely has been doing that stuff for a number of years already. And they're also building secure frameworks for other developers to be more productive and not have to think about these things as abstractions. So they build the predicates, developers go build on top of those, and they don't have to worry about simple things like input sanitization or output encoding or anything like that. So yes, we're definitely doing that. The stuff that I'm referring to is automating analytics with respect to telemetry from either a network, an endpoint, or a server network, or a server itself.
And I'd answer that pretty similarly. You know, we really want to get visibility into the hands of the developers so that they can see issues with their applications right at the point that they're writing it. You know, that's just sort of classic software engineering, and it certainly applies to security vulnerabilities as well. Specific to automation, though, I see a lot of potential in automating responses to events as we see them in the environment, using frameworks like AWS Lambda as a way to look for messages about how our applications are running and take automated responses for them. So both, yes, from the developer perspective, but then also in operations.
Yeah, no, and so we're certainly doing the same sort of things of combining telemetry data with our own external collected intel and working with customers on that. But maybe more interestingly, I think you know, going through our own Chef installation where we define our whole setup, and then we cross-reference that with our collection in you know, various Russian forums and so on. So if there is a new vulnerability discussed by the bad guys that is not yet being prioritized by the NIST and all of these sort of things, we will alert on that immediately internally, and you know, that can literally happen in minutes or hours. So you know, being able to do that sort of automation we find pretty compelling, and sort of, you know, real-time intel.
So if we take that one step further, are any of you all looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of the automation piece that you want to talk about?
Normally, I would say you'd have to take a shot for saying those two words. Machine learning and artificial intelligence, because they're so buzzwordy.
Agreed.
I walk the RSA show floor every year to do the vendor expo walk of shame, and it makes me really sad because most of the vendors can't explain to you what they're actually doing or why they're there or what they're selling or what they can make better for you. But there's almost always ML or AI attached to stuff now.
But some are doing certain things, at least on the machine learning side.
One could argue with very wild variance in efficacy.
Okay.
So I will say, like, we are definitely investigating those things, not necessarily AI, but machine learning and data science applied to our domain can be effective, provided you have a good training set. I don't think unsupervised learning is working well for intrusion detection yet, but we have some colleagues that work at other organizations in our area that are investigating this in some more detail, that have a lot more money than we do and a lot more people and a lot more time. And we're kind of waiting to see if their experiments pan out before we invest heavily.
Okay.
On our platform abuse side, machine learning and data science has already been super effective and impactful.
Okay.
Yeah, no, so a couple of angles on that. So I've done analytics in Intel for a long time, 20 years or 25 years probably, to make myself sound really old, and unfortunately that's probably true. You know, a lot of analytics is frankly just do sums and averages and look at database records. Always remember that that's what matters. And then before we get into all the fancy words, also remember that, you know, it is a good thing to put the AI word aside and talk about it as machine learning, just to avoid humanoids and robots and all of these sort of things. In fact, we like to think about it as sort of Intel centaurs. Can we enable the Intel analyst to be stronger by providing him some additional tool sets? Now, to get concrete though, so where we have done really nice progress, so we do a lot of natural language processing to be able to find things like if a threat actor in a forum says in Russian, tomorrow I'll be launching a new version of my exploit kit in, you know, at this place, you know, at this date or whatever, and supporting this new CV, something like that in Russian. And so we've been writing event detectors for that historically in you know, in a good old programming language, rules-based approach. So, you know, you could call it AI, but I wouldn't call it AI. Now we are training event detectors for that based on, we take 20,000 training sentences that we've developed using Crowdflower, you know, and then actually are able to get to the same precision as we could get with our old rules-based approaches in doing human language detection. Very, very cool. On the other side, what we've been working on is taking 3-4 years worth of historical threat lists and then training detectors where we combine these threat lists of known bad IP and domain addresses and then combining them with 50 factors of our open source intel and then coming up with detectors that will say something about IP addresses or domain names that we've never observed before. And then prove out that we can show both of out of sample training data sets as well as out of completely raw out of sample data have good or efficacy, if you want, or precision and recall on this, and it's getting really good. So, you know, it's still on the edge, but it's a lot of fun.
I don't know if I have a whole lot to add to that. What I'll say from the perspective of an insurance company, data science and analyzing risk is fundamental to how the business operates. That's how actuarial tables are built and how insurance products are priced. As cybersecurity professionals, we do not have nearly the level of robustness around when we say something is a medium risk versus a high risk. Well, what does that actually mean? I'm not the person within Liberty who's working on it. We do have a team looking into how can you apply data science to to security problems and security logs and information that we have. So it's an area of interest, but we are nowhere near as mature as we need to be.
So on that subject, I can comment at some links. So I've had some exposure to this. Having been an analytics developer about a half a dozen times in my career, we've been doing this sort of thing for a long time. We used to call it statistical anomaly detection. We had different names for it. And it was more statistical a decade ago than it was machine learning based today. Both approaches can be productive at some cost. There's a fair amount of cost in terms of learning that the algorithms need to undergo, and the end result of the learning is not always predictable. There is a company here in Cambridge actually doing this that's spun out of NSA that's pretty interesting, and they're doing an approach, a more of a machine learning approach that's sometimes called graph analysis. And the use case that I gave them that I'm interested in seeing develop is what I would call entity relationship-based anomaly detection is a very promising application for machine learning. The way I would explain that is my dog is about as smart as an IDS. He does simple intrusion detection that my dog will bark at anything that's not a dog. So ducks, squirrels, he has a 100% detection rate at anything that's not dog. But he also does simple anomaly detection. So in the winter when the Charles River ice is over, my dog will bark at the ice because it didn't used to be there, and so it looks bad. And so he doesn't understand that, well, this is actually normal. It's a seasonal relationship. But as humans, we don't call 911 when we see ice in the river, because we understand that that's a normal relationship with the river. But if we were to see, say, an oil slick or somebody drowning in the river, we would raise the alarm because that's an abnormal relationship. So the ability to separate normal from abnormal relationships through graph analysis is great potential. It's very expensive to do, but I think it may have great potential for things like intrusion detection.
Very good. Thank you. Questions from the audience at this point? In the back.
So, all the panelists mentioned that automation was a major priority. So, what would
Well, I'd be happy to talk about some specifics. So having done several rounds of automation in my previous life, I'm planning to repeat some of the same things currently. So for example, when it comes to things like vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management is something that often always doesn't quite get done quite right or well in some organizations, because sometimes you find that senior security people just don't want to do vulnerability management. They want to do something more challenging. And junior people maybe don't want to do it because they're afraid of getting it wrong and they're afraid to touch it. And developers don't want anything to do with it because they don't want to, one, it's kind of mysterious. But two, I think we too often ask them to learn new and unfamiliar tools. Like for example, a lot of security teams like to use Nessus. And Nessus is a great tool, but it's not something that's familiar to developers. And developers don't really want to leave their IDE. They want to stay in their IDE and be productive and feel happy. And they don't want to go learn to use Nessus or something else. So one of the things I have done is building an abstraction layer to sit in front of Nessus so that people can make calls into it, so that Nessus scans and things like that can be incorporated into system tests. I think that's a great case for automation. I think vulnerability management in general is a great candidate for automation in terms of consuming vulnerability bulletins, getting them into JIRA, and doing cross-correlation between vulnerability bulletins and vulnerability scan detects in your environment to look for matches, and then raising priority accordingly. All of that can be automated almost completely, and there's really no reason that it shouldn't be, because if you look at the cost of security talent today, it's very expensive to actually pay humans to do this.
+1 unless I get 2 votes, in that case +2. As we said at the start, looking at containerizing applications, containerizing infrastructure, and getting visibility into the vulnerabilities that come down in the container platforms that are coming up. How can we automate scanning of what we're pushing through the CI/CD pipelines so that we really give developers in the IDE where they spend their day, visibility into the security state of what they're pushing out? Tremendous value there.
Thank you. So I'll answer your question in 2 ways. So firstly, automating a response to something clearly bad is super easy. So we're doing that already. And I think that that's the most clear, easiest case for automation. Secondly, we try to preserve engineer time because we have engineering scarcity, as I think all of us have pointed out. There are only so many people in the world to do this type of work that are well qualified. So we're all trying to hire. That's a challenge. We all have unstaffed positions open. So we're trying to preserve our engineering time as much as possible. So if we can surface an alert to an engineer to say, hey, like this thing happened, go check this out. And by the way, of all the systems we know about, here's a big bucket of stuff so that you don't have to go pivot into other data sets and like wait for a Hive query to finish or wait for a whatever query to finish in a commercial system, something like that. So we're looking at contextual. I think the common word now is contextualization for this type of stuff. So we're looking to do context and to surface those things. And I think it's going to be super hard for us in the near term to clearly say, outside of the this is evil thing, what's in between clearly good, and that is really hard to interpret. So we still need people to do that in the near term until somebody has some magic ML AI thing for us that we'll totally buy. Right. Thank you.
No, that's good. And I think there's sort of many times when you do automation, it's obviously the mundane stuff that gets in the way. You know, for us, many times is this, and anybody who's been hands-on keyboard with this stuff knows, you know, just combining data sets or, you know, some of the basic stuff just gets in the way. So the magic wand can solve some of those basic problems. Now, since you gave us a magic wand, I'll say that the one we would like to do would be, and this is now may sound, you know, edgy to some, but when we are in some of the harder to get to places where the bad guys hang out, they read log files too. And, you know, so figuring out if the magic wand could help us imitate a human all the way to avoid being detected by the bad guy, that could be pretty helpful too. So that will take a good magic wand. So
There's a startup in the making. All right. Oh, sir.
Oh, sure. That's a great question. So repeat the question. So I mentioned earlier looking at an anomalous command line in a terminal on a Mac, and this gentleman asked, what are we using to get that data? So we have a bunch of stuff. We committed a patch back to the OS query project for bash history. We also have a custom agent. So yeah, between those two, we get all the interesting commands and process chaining. So for example, was this launched from a logon process? Was it, what console was it on? Things like that. And that will give us the parameters. And then with our custom agent, if they choose to run something that, say, like a Python script, we can then, in semi-real time, go reap that script as well and ingest that somewhere else for analysis. On Windows, for example, we're a big sysmon shop. And we like OS query on Windows as well, which we haven't yet migrated to, similar to what Liam was describing earlier. So on Windows, we have to answer the same question there. We do PowerShell logging, both module and script block. And then we pick all the regular system logs up in addition to sysmon. So it's pretty rich.
Very good. Thank you. So let's change the direction up a little bit. What's that? Oh, question. The question was, any concerns around privacy?
Thank you. Yes, there are. Absolutely. So we try to preserve privacy as best we can, but the people that have to review this data and the machines that collect it are not, they're in a separate enclave. So we definitely have trust boundaries there that are not the regular corporate trust boundaries. We also want to preserve our tools in case an attacker ever gets in our environment too. But yes, people on our team that have to do this work, we vet them well, and then we monitor them proactively if they abuse the tools. That's a huge problem. But yes, we do monitor proactive abuse as well.
And an increasingly complex problem for global organizations. Privacy rules and laws vary dramatically across the globe, and that's a real issue operating at enterprise scale.
That's why I tell people I couldn't have written a better job description 20 years ago for what I'm doing now.
No, we do
These
the
things
same
are
things.
these things are fascinating.
We've had to write sort of extensive harvesting policies or collection policies internally about what can we do with certain kinds of data, who can do what, those sort of things. And also then largely take an approach, let's just try to delete history so that there is nothing really to go review. And that's something that we've sort of, for query logs, all this sort of stuff that people might be worried about. So we've sort of, I think we found a good balance, but no, we've got to be very careful about those things because it's easy to trip up and do the wrong thing.
Just to be super clear on that too, we're really transparent internally. So we tell people what we're doing if they ask, and we tell people proactively, like, hey, this is how we do intrusion detection here. So we're an engineering team like any other team at Dropbox, and we are very transparent with what we do.
All right, so we've kind of touched in a couple of places on open source. So let's hit it square on. What kind of open source tools are you using today? And when you look at, and/or when you look at new tools, new open source tools, how do you evaluate them?
Great question. So we use Bro. We also use another IDS that's commercial. Between the two, we get great coverage. We enjoy that a lot. On endpoints, we use Sysmon, we use OSQuery. We do a lot of log analysis off basic logs as well, both on Windows, Mac, and then Linux in our environment. We also use Audit-D, which is built into most either Linux systems we have or Macs. And then we also really enjoy the Santa project by Google, which is intended to be an application whitelisting platform, but you can run it in a audit configuration that will just log stuff. Between the two, really, really rich coverage. We used to have a commercial solution for both Windows and Mac, and because we're like 90-something% Mac, we're Mac first, and that solution, despite 2 years of effort, we decided to not renew because we had performance issues with them. So random kernel panics, significant impact to developers, and the solution that we implemented recently ourselves, based on Audit and Santa for our Macs, is both performant and gives us the data we need.
And it's built around an open source
That's right.
package.
That's
Okay.
right. So the OpenBSM stuff is built into Mac OS. You can go read about it yourself. Audit-D on Linux is fairly well understood and documented, also open source, built into the kernel. OSQuery, also open source. Sysmon is not open source, but it's free. And they're pretty responsive to requests for new features.
So similar list of tools for me. So I'm a fan of Snort or Suricata, which is a multi-threaded version of Snort in the intrusion detection space. Bro, of course, is also very useful. They're both very popular tools. I use, there are some decent anti-malware tools for Linux. There's one called the Linux Malware Detect Project, which seems to be getting more popular than ClamAV in many circles. There's an interesting tool from Google called GRR. It's called, I think it stands for Google Rapid Response. It stands for something response. It has the ability to do memory dumps and a lot of live response. It's kind of interesting. I do use a mix of, I'm not a purist, so I use a mix of open source and commercial tools. So I actually do use a productized Audit-D tool from a company here in Boston called ThreatStack. And that was kind of a build versus buy decision for me. I think the build versus buy conversation sometimes gets us into a little bit of a false dichotomy, because sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, well, we don't use open source because we can't get support. We only use commercial tools. So they'll go to RSA and they'll buy one of everything, or they'll go to Black Hat and they'll buy one of everything, and then they'll have tools in a closet waiting to get installed. And some people say, well, we don't buy, we only build tools. And it's a little bit of a false dichotomy, I think, because you think about it, we don't actually practice a build versus buy philosophy. We don't build Jira, we don't build Confluence, we don't build HipChat or Slack. We don't build AWS, for that matter. We use public cloud platforms for the same reason we don't build our own electricity generating stations. So I think for me, the decision revolves around what is the best tool for the engagement that I'm in, because security is a very adversarial process. And the adversaries don't have arbitrary constraints. They won't put constraints on themselves to the effect of saying like, well, we won't build, or we practice build versus buy, or buy versus build. They don't have scope restrictions. They don't have the same kinds of restrictions that a lot of security tools have. So if you wanted to win on the playing field against the adversary, you need to make very good decisions around tooling and preserve your freedom to maneuver.
Yeah, well said. Similar perspective from my organization. I think maybe a different way to ask the question is how many of the commercially supported products that we're running are actually under the covers a fork of an open source product to which support was added so that it can be deployed at enterprise scale. Because if you're deploying across 6 data centers and 35,000 machine images, having a good support model behind it is important at enterprise scale. But specifically within the security space, it really, I would support giving the analysts the tools that they need that they find most useful.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to echo what the other guy says. We'll use we have a massive Elasticsearch sort of installed. We have a big MongoDB installed, a lot of open source stuff. Now, at the bottom of all of that, we pay a massive amount of money to Amazon, like probably a lot of other people in the room. And, so it ends up being a mix. I think the way that I think the key thing is that we try to think about the way that we output data. It should be able to flow as well into open source stuff as well as into commercial software, and really try to push that to give people the choice that they need.
So a couple of quick observations. First, I think I heard that in certain instances you don't just have one thing. You may have multiple instances from, it might be a combination of commercial and open source types of products. And from a coverage perspective, you're looking at, sort of like you were saying, the best coverage possible. What about when we mix the budget into this? How does that affect things? We didn't really talk about budget just now, and the assumption usually is that open source is either free or, depending on how it's been architected, it's cheaper than maybe some commercial, or custom solution. So from a budget perspective, how do you approach things, and who controls the budget in your organization?
I'll go first, I guess.
You're always in the hot seat
yeah,
here.
it's all right. I chose it. Smart man. So there are different ways to think about budget. I spend a lot of time thinking about engineer time. As I described earlier, that's one of our primary constraints. So we have a lot of smart people. We try to hire smart people. We try to retain them. And we try to keep them happy building cool stuff for us. That incurs technical debt. So people have to maintain that stuff. We just open sourced a Slack bot that we wrote internally. It was an intern project last summer. It's awesome. We see you do something weird. It'll Slack you and say, hey, I'm security bot. We saw you did X. Did you do this? And you can it tells you how to respond to it. And you can say yes, no, or whatever. And then it'll push to you over Duo to make sure that an attacker is not on your box, typing that for you, which is great. It's not original. Slack did it first. They did it best. We just copied them and open sourced it before they did. So, ironically, someone has to maintain.
This is all off the record, right?
Totally.
Chatham House rules.
Totally. So someone has to maintain that code. When it breaks, we have a MySQL backend we built internally for it. It hooks into 2 different data infrastructure systems, a commercial SIM, an open source thing. It requires care and feeding, and occasionally it breaks. And when it breaks in unpredictable ways that we didn't imagine a year ago. And so in my mind, which is sort of controversial maybe here, I would like to spend money for a vendor to do something versus an engineer building a new thing most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. Mostly because I can lean on the vendor, and the vendor has to maintain their stuff, and it's much cheaper for me to write a check for I don't know, we don't have that many endpoints, so we have 2,000, right? Which is a very different scale from most people. So I can write a check for manage EDR much easier than I can hire a person. It's much, much easier to do that. We don't do that for various reasons, but on average, I would like to buy and not eliminate or not incur technical debt that we have to keep maintaining over time. That doesn't always work, like I described. We just got rid of our commercial EDR vendor. We built the thing. We didn't invent this stuff. We took the hub and the spokes and we just put the wheel together. And the wheel works. It works for us. It may not work for you, but we like it. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's how we think about it. And in our organization, our CFO controls the budget, and ultimately our CEO. So when I write up a budget for the year, I say, hey, 2017, I did it in Q4 of last year, and I said, hey, this is all the stuff we want next year. This is why we want it. This is what we're going to do with it. And I found it to be very effective to write in plain English that a non-security person will understand, and to compare and contrast what we can or can't do if we don't get these things. And that really helps a lot. But we obviously only have a finite amount of money to go around.
So compare and contrast from a risk perspective. If we don't
Yes.
do this, these are the risks that
Or
increase.
Or saying hey, if I don't spend money on X, our service may degrade in response time, or perhaps we're going to have to shunt out that project that we want to do in Q2 of next year, or perhaps we're going to have to hire someone to do something instead, which is always more challenging. So.
Yeah, and to underscore what you said about the engineering effort needed to support in many contexts, I really want to underscore the importance of the opportunity cost that enterprises pay when they have engineers supporting that, because the engineer who is managing an environment is not an engineer who's writing code which is going to differentiate our products and create compelling business value to our customers. And in a environment where there are a shortage of skilled resources, I think we'd rather have people building and delivering products instead of supporting infrastructure that we could license that support from a vendor.
So I guess in our org, I am the one who sets the budget eventually. But the way I like to think about it is that I'd like, so it's one thing if we do something ad hoc, use the heck whatever you want. I don't care. Like that's, I trust that people make the good choice. Now, if it's something that really is going to be in our core collection or analytics infrastructure, I want to know that it's something that's going to stay around or stick around. And a lot of open source stuff is sort of, people say that it's open source, but it's like a guy, and the guy might sort of lose interest in it next year, or it's some, they just haven't figured out the business model, and few of the open source stuff have really figured that out, I think. So, so we try to think about it as, if it's something that's going to go in the quote unquote the big system, there better be a good model for the long term for it. And if it does, hey, that's great, and we do a lot of that. But if it's something where I'm still a bit nervous, is this thing really going to be around? Then, maybe less excited. So.
Sorry, go ahead.
So in my case, it's similar. In a startup like myself, it's kind of a multi-stakeholder process. So as a head of security, I tend to identify what we need and what it's going to cost. And then it's a matter of reaching consensus with stakeholders from engineering, development and product management. And it's important to sort of learn to speak business in these conversations. As a security lead, it's increasingly important because product management are interested in customer sentiment, customer requirements, and net effect on product margins overall. So those are all considerations that have to be carefully worked out. And then at that point, once reaching consensus amongst that level of stakeholders, then typically it goes up to the CEO for a final decision is the way the process works. And it's very much a build versus buy consideration in my environment. I don't really start from a premise of, well, we should or should not use open source for this or that. I try to identify what would be the most efficient way to meet customer expectations and to meet internal security priorities. Like in my case, it wouldn't really be efficient for me to build and operate a large-scale audit D collection analysis infrastructure. It isn't necessarily efficient for me to build and operate a large-scale parse search SIM tool like Elk or something like Splunk, for example. It's much more efficient to let somebody else do that who's already doing it at great scale.
Okay. Questions from the audience at this point? Sir.
I'm curious who you guys see as your main adversaries. So when you're building your prep models, are you thinking about nation state adversaries or scripted is Russia? And how does that affect what you build out and what you say, okay, well, this all is what's happening here, we can't care about China?
Yes. Yes. Like if you're, yeah, we're concerned with all those things. And we routinely see all those things. We have a lot of data, as you might imagine. People want that data. It's a diverse array. And then we see people trying to utilize our platform too, which is more interesting.
Trying to
Utilize our platform? Yeah. Definitely concerned with all those things. And I think we talked about this, I think I touched on it briefly earlier, and I talked about it at another conference. We have a custom agent we wrote, and we don't talk about that anywhere. Just that we have it. So if you're going to come at us, you're going to take some time to figure that out, and we hope we catch you first. So we'll talk about the open source stuff we use mostly. We use some commercial things. You can probably guess what they are maybe sometimes over time. We routinely see B teams aware of endpoint detection and response tools, and they quickly subvert them. So this has been a game that's been afoot for a couple of years, depending on who your adversary is. Not Five Eyes, obviously, but other B teams. And it's pretty disturbing the first time you see that in action. So we have a custom agent. We don't talk about it. It makes sure everything else is good, and it watches for stuff that those things can't do.
I've Sorry, I have similar experience. So I think we see kind of, we see the C and the D teams are active on a daily basis, and they're relatively, some of them are relatively unstructured threats that are just looking for off-the-shelf vulnerabilities. They're just running pure dumb scans and looking for whatever they can get. They're doing things like Bitcoin mining or spam generation or click fraud or various low-level fraud schemes. And then there are kind of the next level of more structured threats that are for-profit fraud organizations. They have capabilities of doing things like the ransomware we're seeing today, where they actually, the researchers are saying that somebody's actually taken one of the exploits from the NSA dump and retrofitted a piece of ransomware with this exploit, which is a pretty interesting thing to do. There are people like that. And then there are what they call the B teams. And I've seen a fair amount of that being mostly in the defense and military sector. And I know what people used to tell me then was that, at least at the time, a lot of people think that we haven't actually seen the A team yet, and then we won't see the A team until there's an actual shooting war in cyberspace, like an actual large-scale conflict. That you kind of hold the A team in reserve as a strategic reserve, and you don't bring them out until you're ready to go to war. Whether that's true or not is an open question. But I think in general, you need to be prepared for unstructured threats on a daily basis of various kinds, and the day may come, not everybody is targeted by a structured threat or a targeted attack, but some of us will be, so you need to think about having plans on the shelf for that if and when it happens.
So the way I'd like to think about it, we're in the business of intelligence, so then, of course, it's the person who you might be disrupting who's going to be at you. Historically, you can go look at our company and find every conspiracy theory on the planet, so that could open you up to various sort of activists or hacktivists if you want. Now, generally, I will say, a lot of people use the word targeted. We'd like to think that we've not been targeted. We've sort of been exposed to things, and I think most people are not targeted. They're being exposed. But, as you deal with criminals, and if you're upset the ways of criminals' ability to make money, or if you get in the way of we'll call it, I like to call them intelligence agencies rather than something else. If you get in the way of an intelligence agency's, work to collect, they will find ways to deal with that. So yes, all of the above. Unfortunately, that life is much easier if you can sort of do nice threat modeling and say, I'm worried about that. We don't have that luxury.
And I'll say, as a security architect, I don't execute the threat modeling activities myself. I'm a customer of those who do execute the threat models. And so as we look to explore the threat universe, as we look to respond to findings that our SOC has seen or that our red team has seen, those come as inputs into the architecture process and then lead to discussions about what do we need to change, what do we need to build to stay ahead of those threats.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Anyone? Yes, sir.
How does the feedback system go between sort of the intrusion detection, making sure no lead into the side, and actually, and people who make the product or whatever it is that your company makes, and saying maybe this is data that we don't want to keep, maybe this is data that we want to have protected in a different way. For instance, for say the Dropbox case, right, there are small companies like Trusted where they go and they put the data on the user side, so it doesn't even make its way in their company, so they're slightly less vulnerable. How does that conversation happen?
So I think the question is, what is the feedback cycle or loop between the security team and the product team? Okay.
Yeah, so I'll say very much in the way I answered the last question. We're shifting to a different model about the way we might handle that, but sort of a triad within the security function between the risk analytics side, the architecture side, designing solutions, and then the delivery side. So a direct defined feedback loop between those three organizations working closely together so that we can take the findings that we're seeing either in daily operations or through threat modeling and prioritize those based on how the threat model is developed by our risk team.
It's probably one of the most valuable functions that a security lead can perform is to bring security, risk, and vulnerability data back to a development team and help them to prioritize it. Because some vulnerabilities are relatively serious and some of them are not. Some are more trivial. And not every bug gets fixed in a given software product. Some of them are unimportant enough to stay in the backlog. Some of them are important enough they need to be fixed immediately. So helping to get that feedback back into development teams, helping developers understand what it is they're seeing in the report that comes out of the vulnerability scanner or the source code analyzer and things like that is very important.
And being able to demonstrate and show that this is not just some security guy complaining. This is something that is very real. Here's what the exploit looks like. Here's how it can actually break your system. Make it real for the development team to understand and prioritize that as something that needs to be fixed.
Excellent.
I was just going to say, I don't have a lot to add. We have a product security team who focuses on that as part of their core mission. And they work pretty closely with their product development teams as well. But it's just not my domain.
Well, that's it for this panel. Let's give a round of applause for the panelists.
And thank you, Randy, for hosting, and thank you guys all for being here. Hopefully you'll be here for a few minutes if anybody wants to connect.